She sat motionless, her hands clasped tight, a faint smirk tugging at the edge of her lips, as if she already knew how the day would end. The polished wood of the courtroom glowed faintly under the overhead lights, the quiet hum of the air conditioning filling the gaps between whispers. She looked unbothered, confident, almost rehearsed, like she'd walked this scene in her mind before. The part where she stands, the judge nods, and she finally walks out those double doors into freedom. That belief clung to her face like a mask. But masks have a way of slipping, and when the screen flickered to life across the room, when the video began to play, everything changed. The sound in the courtroom seemed to vanish. All at once, the calm she'd built began to crumble. The grainy footage filled the room, and what everyone saw was enough to turn that confidence into silence. Two young men, both full of life hours before, were now gone. And the proof of how it happened played out in front of them like a nightmare caught on tape. For weeks, she had told everyone it was an accident, a mistake, a horrible twist of fate. She cried when the cameras pointed at her, whispered apologies through trembling lips, tried to paint herself as the one who suffered most. But the evidence didn't cry. It didn't stutter or shift blame. It showed the truth unflinching. A truth that ripped away every lie she'd tried to hide behind. That day in that courtroom, Mackenzie Shirilla realized she wasn't walking home. Not after what they'd seen. Not after what she'd done. Just a year earlier, she looked like any other teenager. Her Instagram was filled with smiling selfies, cropped sunsets, and short clips of her dancing to the latest songs. To anyone watching, she was just another girl from Strongsville, Ohio. A quiet suburb where the most excitement came from football games and late-night drives. Her friends described her as funny, carefree, always chasing fun. She had the kind of energy that made her stand out. But behind the filters, things weren't as bright. Mackenzie was in a relationship with 20-year-old Dominic Russo, a boy everyone seemed to know. He was good-looking, popular, always surrounded by people. Their relationship started like a typical teenage romance, cute posts, long drives, and whispered promises of forever. But over time, the love turned sharp. Friends said they fought constantly, jealousy, accusations, control, a mix that made them inseparable yet dangerously unstable. By the summer of 2022, that tension had started to boil over. Text messages showed them arguing almost daily. Friends said Mackenzie had become possessive, unpredictable, that her moods could swing from laughter to rage in seconds. Still, Dominic stayed. Maybe he thought he could fix it, or maybe he just didn't believe things could really go that far. But in the early hours of July 31st, 2022, everything went too far. The streets of Strongsville were empty, the sky still dark. It was around 5:30 a.m. when a silver Toyota Camry appeared on a surveillance camera in an industrial area far from any homes. Inside the car was Mackenzie at the wheel, Dominic in the passenger seat, and their friend, 19-year-old David Flanagan, sitting in the back. They had spent the night together, talking, driving, maybe arguing. No one knows exactly. But what happened next would change everything. The footage showed the car creeping slowly down a deserted street, the headlights slicing through the fog. It paused, circled back, and then accelerated. In a blink, it hit 100 miles per hour. Seconds later, the Camry slammed into the brick wall of an empty warehouse. The impact was so violent it crumpled the car like paper. When first responders arrived, all they saw was twisted metal and smoke. The front of the car was gone, crushed inward. Dominic and David were dead before help even arrived. The only one still alive, somehow, was Mackenzie. She was trapped behind the wheel, bloodied but conscious, breathing shallowly. Firefighters worked frantically to pull her out. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, her eyes fluttered open. She was alive, but the two boys weren't. At first, no one questioned it. A late-night crash, a teenage driver, maybe she lost control. It happens too often. But something about the scene didn't sit right. There were no skid marks, not a single sign that she'd tried to stop. The crash site itself was strange too. That road wasn't on the way to anyone's home. It wasn't a shortcut or a popular hangout spot. It led nowhere. Days later, police retrieved the car's black box, the event data recorder that tracks speed, braking, and acceleration. What it showed turned the investigation upside down. In those final seconds before the crash, Mackenzie had floored the accelerator. She never touched the brakes. The speed climbed, 60, 80, 100, and then impact. It wasn't a loss of control. It wasn't panic. It was intentional. Investigators began digging deeper, searching for a reason. They found messages between Mackenzie and Dominic, fights, threats, angry rants. Friends recalled her saying things she didn't mean, or maybe she did. One remembered her joking about crashing the car to end it all, but now it didn't sound like a joke. Then came the most chilling discovery. Footage from days before the crash showing Mackenzie driving along that same road. The same path, the same turn, the same warehouse wall. Police called it a test run. It looked like she had been planning it. And as they pieced everything together, the story that once looked like a tragic accident began to look like something darker, cold, deliberate. Meanwhile, somewhere in Strongsville, officers knocked on a door. Inside, Dominic's mother was just waking up. She thought maybe it was a noise complaint or a routine question. But when she saw their faces, she knew. Before they even spoke, she knew. When they said her son's name, the air left her lungs. Her knees gave out. Her voice broke into screams that carried down the street. "It can't be true," she cried. "Please, tell me they're in jail. Tell me they're not dead." But they were, and no amount of denial could change that. While the mothers grieved and the community tried to make sense of the unthinkable, Mackenzie lay in a hospital bed, the world calling her lucky to be alive. But for investigators, that survival meant something else entirely. She'd have to face what she'd done. And when she finally did, when the truth began to unfold in the courtroom, that same calm expression she wore when she thought she was going home wouldn't last much longer. The courtroom had quieted again, but the atmosphere was far from calm. You could feel it, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the girl at the defense table. She sat rigid, hands clasped tightly, her knuckles white. Moments ago, her voice had cracked with practiced innocence, weaving a story that sounded rehearsed but desperate, the kind of story that begs for sympathy, even when the truth sits just outside the light. She had spent months crafting her version of events. A tragic misunderstanding, she claimed. She never meant for things to go that far. She didn't know what she was doing. She was scared, pressured, confused. The script was flawless. At least that's what she thought. But the prosecution had been patient, watching her with that calm, surgical focus of someone who already knows how the story really ends. They hadn't interrupted her, hadn't objected much. They let her speak freely, letting her own words tighten around her like an invisible noose. When she finished, a low hum of whispers rippled through the courtroom gallery. Reporters scribbled notes, jurors exchanged uneasy glances, and the judge looked toward the prosecutor. The woman rose slowly, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She adjusted her jacket, clicked a pen shut, and took a deliberate step toward the evidence screen. The defense attorney's posture shifted, a subtle sign that he knew what was coming. "Your Honor," she said, her tone steady, "the state would like to play a short video for the court." The words landed like a tremor. The girl's head snapped up. Her composure faltered for the first time. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something meant to reassure her, but her eyes were locked on that blank monitor at the front of the room, the one that had stayed dark all day. Until now. The judge gave a nod. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly, and the soft hum of the old courtroom projector filled the silence. The prosecutor pressed play. At first, the image was shaky, handheld footage, a bit grainy, but unmistakably real. A timestamp flickered in the corner. The girl on the screen looked younger, freer, unaware of the storm her future self would face in this very room. She was laughing, a kind of laugh that didn't belong to someone who claimed she'd been traumatized. The jurors leaned forward. Then, as the clip continued, the laughter faded into something else. Voices turned cruel. A tone that had been missing from her testimony filled the room. Arrogance, disdain, mockery. It was her voice, crystal clear. Every word a contradiction to what she had just told the court. The girl's face drained of color. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting slightly as though she might speak, but no sound came. Her lawyer's eyes darted toward the judge, searching for a lifeline, an objection, anything. None came. The judge simply watched, unblinking. The footage showed her and two friends, filmed just hours after the incident. The same incident she had described as a moment of panic, but in the video there was no panic. Only laughter, jokes, smirks. One of her friends had said something that made her laugh even harder. Something so callous that even the audience in the courtroom audibly gasped when they heard it. The prosecutor paused the video. The frame froze mid-laugh, the girl's face bright, cruelly carefree. The image lingered in silence. This, the prosecutor said softly, was recorded less than 12 hours after she says she was too traumatized to remember anything clearly. The courtroom felt smaller now. The girl's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She turned her head slightly, eyes darting to the jury box. They weren't looking at her anymore with pity. Some looked angry, others just disappointed. Her father, seated in the second row behind the defense table, buried his face in his hands. Her mother's shoulders shook quietly beside him. The prosecutor resumed the video. The last seconds were worse than the first. The girl looked into the camera, smirking, and said something no one in that courtroom would ever forget. A line so self-satisfied and cold, it would replay endlessly in news clips, in social media edits, in the minds of everyone who watched it that day. When it ended, the room was utterly still. The hum of the projector died, replaced by the sound of distant traffic outside. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. The judge leaned forward. "Miss," he began, but she spoke first. That's not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice trembling. It was a joke." But no one believed her now. The illusion was gone. Every carefully rehearsed line, every tear, every trembling sigh, all of it had evaporated in an instant. The prosecutor stepped closer. "A joke?" she repeated quietly. "Because it doesn't sound like one." The defense attorney rose quickly, his voice rising in a futile objection, but even he sounded uncertain, defeated. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Miss," the judge said again, more firmly this time, "that video contradicts nearly every statement you've made under oath." Her breathing quickened. She shook her head, strands of hair sticking to her cheeks. No, I swear, it's not. I didn't mean..." But the words tangled, collapsing under their own weight. The prosecutor simply stepped back, her expression unreadable. The evidence had spoken louder than anything she could add, and in that silence, everyone knew the verdict hadn't been spoken yet. But the truth had already been heard. Outside, reporters were already typing headlines they hadn't even seen the end of. Inside, a teenage girl sat frozen, realizing that her lies had just met their mirror, and the reflection was unforgiving. The silence after the video ended felt alive, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The judge hadn't yet spoken, and still, everyone in the courtroom knew something irreversible had just happened. The air was thick with disbelief, tension, and the quiet rustle of people trying not to move too suddenly, as if any sound might shatter what was left of the illusion. The girl sat motionless, eyes locked on the frozen image, still faintly visible on the screen, her own smirking face, captured forever in that cruel instant. She wanted to look away, to close her eyes, to pretend it wasn't her, but she couldn't. It was like the video had reached out and nailed her to that chair. Her mind replayed every word she'd said earlier on the stand, every tear she'd forced, every plea for mercy. Now all of it sounded hollow in her own memory, rehearsed and insincere. The judge shifted slightly, his robes whispering as he leaned forward. "Oh, miss," he said quietly, the measured calm of his voice somehow more terrifying than anger. "Do you understand what this means?" Her lips trembled. She nodded once, but no words came. The prosecutor stayed standing by the screen, her posture composed, but her eyes sharp, watching. She didn't need to say anything more. The video had done her job for her. Around the courtroom, the jurors avoided looking directly at the girl. Their faces were pale, tight, uncomfortable. Some seemed angry, others disappointed, but none showed the compassion they had earlier when they thought she was a frightened, misunderstood teenager. The defense attorney rubbed his temples, a long exhale escaping him. He'd known this moment was coming. He'd begged her before trial to tell the full truth, to come clean before the evidence surfaced. But she'd insisted the video didn't matter, that no one would find it, that it wasn't as bad as people claimed. Now, as it played on a loop in everyone's mind, he realized her confidence hadn't been strength. It had been arrogance. The judge straightened and looked toward the prosecutor. "Is there anything further from the state?" The prosecutor shook her head. "No, Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself." "Defense?" The attorney hesitated. He looked down at his client, who sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, shaking her head slowly, whispering something he couldn't quite hear. He turned back toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said softly, "we request a brief recess." The judge's gaze flicked from him to the girl and back again. He could see what the attorney was asking for. Not just time, but mercy. "You have 15 minutes, he said finally. His gavel tapped once, and the courtroom stirred to life. The girl stood quickly, her knees wobbling beneath her. Her lawyer guided her toward the small consultation room beside the chamber, but she hesitated at the door. Reporters' eyes followed her, pens ready, cameras flashing through the courtroom glass. The whispering buzz followed her out into the hall, that quiet, merciless hum of judgment. Inside the consultation room, she sank into a chair, trembling. Her lawyer shut the door behind them and leaned against it for a moment before speaking. "I told you," he said quietly. "Not angry, just tired. I told you that video would come back." She pressed her palms to her face. "It's not fair," she muttered. "That was before everything happened. Before I even—" "It doesn't matter," he cut in. "It shows intent. It shows attitude. The jury's not going to care when it was recorded. They're going to see what's on it." Her breath came in shaky bursts. "But I didn't mean any of it," she said. "I swear I didn't. We were just talking. I didn't think they'd take it seriously." He sat across from her, lowering his voice. "Then why did you lie on the stand? You said you didn't remember. You said you couldn't recall anything after that night. And now there's a video of you laughing about it." Her eyes welled with tears, and for a moment she looked like a child again, fragile, cornered, desperate to rewind time. "I thought I could fix it," she whispered. "I thought if I said the right things, they'd believe me." He sighed and looked away. "The truth doesn't need the right words," he said. "It just needs to be true." For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above them. Then a knock came at the door. A court officer stepped in. "It's time," he said. The girl's pulse spiked. She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, but her hands were still trembling. Her lawyer opened the door, and they stepped back into the hallway. Reporters turned like sharks scenting blood, their whispers growing louder. Cameras flashed again, capturing every step she took back toward the courtroom, every sign of panic she tried to hide. When she re-entered, the judge was already seated. The jury had returned to their box, their eyes unreadable. The video monitor had been turned off now, but its ghost seemed to linger in the air. The prosecution's table was silent, but no gloating, no smugness. Just quiet certainty. The defense attorney placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as she sat. It was a gesture more out of habit than belief. The judge looked over his glasses. "Miss," he said, "you've been given opportunities to speak the truth. The court is not unsympathetic to youth or to mistakes, but deception, especially under oath, carries consequences." Her chest tightened. She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "Please," she whispered. "I didn't mean to lie. I was scared." "Scared," the judge repeated softly. "And yet that fear didn't stop you from laughing about what you'd done." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat locked. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, as if the world itself was echoing the verdict that hadn't yet been spoken. Inside, everyone waited. The truth had finally stripped her of the story she'd built, and all that remained was the fragile, Raw silence of a girl who'd thought she could outsmart justice until justice found her own voice in that damning video. The courtroom felt colder when they returned from recess. The hum of conversation had died completely now. Even the air seemed to hang still, heavy with the weight of what was coming. The girl sat stiffly at the defense table, hands trembling in her lap. Her eyes darted around the room. The judge, the jury, the prosecutor, the audience filled with strangers who had all come to witness her unravel. No one met her gaze anymore. Her attorney leaned in quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. When the judge asks if you want to speak before sentencing, keep it short. Be honest. Don't make excuses, just speak from your heart. She nodded, though her throat had gone dry. Every instinct told her to beg, to explain, to defend herself, but none of that had worked. Not after the video, not after the laughter they'd all seen. The judge entered, his black robe brushing softly against the floor as he took his seat. Everyone stood. The bailiff's voice echoed, sharp and steady. All rise. Then, as the judge settled, the command came again. You may be seated. The wooden benches creaked as everyone sat, but even that sound seemed cautious, subdued. The judge adjusted his glasses and glanced toward the defense table. Miss, he began, his tone measured, before this court delivers its decision, you are entitled to speak. Is there anything you wish to say? Her heart pounded in her chest. She rose slowly, unsteady on her feet. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, her voice a fragile whisper at first. I just want to say I'm sorry. The words echoed faintly, thin and uncertain. She tried to steady herself, glancing toward the jurors who had once seemed sympathetic, but now looked at her with blank, restrained faces. I never meant for any of this to happen, she continued. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I was scared and I didn't know what to do. I know I made mistakes, but I'm not a bad person. I wish I could take it all back. A tear slipped down her cheek, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw one juror's expression soften, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The prosecutor stood when she finished. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Your Honor, she said calmly, this case has never been about a single mistake. It's been about choices, deliberate ones. The defendant lied to the police, to the jury, and to this court. She didn't make a mistake. She made a decision, and that decision was to protect herself, not the truth. The girl looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The prosecutor continued, her voice steady but firm. The video we saw is not a misunderstanding. It's not immaturity. It's a reflection of who she chose to be when she thought no one was watching. This court has heard enough apologies that come only after the evidence appears. When she sat, the room stayed still. The judge let the silence stretch, long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. Then he turned his attention back to the girl. His voice softened, but his eyes were unwavering. When I first read this case, he began, I saw a young person, someone I hoped had made a mistake born from fear, not malice. I wanted to believe that youth explained everything. But that video, it showed me something else. He paused. The girl's breath hitched. It showed me laughter when there should have been sorrow, arrogance when there should have been remorse, and lies when the truth could have brought healing. I don't see a monster before me, but I also don't see a child who understands the gravity of what she's done. Her knees nearly gave out. She gripped the table to steady herself. Your age may spare you from the harshest penalties, he continued, but it does not spare you from accountability. Actions have consequences, miss, even for those who believe they can hide behind innocence. The girl blinked through tears, trying to speak, but her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, a quiet plea to stay silent. The judge looked down at the papers before him, then back at her. You lied under oath, he said. You manipulated the truth to save yourself. And in doing so you disrespected not only this court, but the very idea of justice. Her lips trembled. She wanted to protest, to say she didn't mean to lie, that it all spiraled out of control, but the words stuck like stones in her throat. I am sentencing you, the judge continued, his tone grave, to a term of confinement appropriate to your actions and your deceit. You will serve time in a juvenile correctional facility. You will undergo counseling, education, and evaluation. This court hopes you will use that time to reflect on what truth actually means." The gavel struck once, a sound that echoed like thunder through the room. The girl's mother gasped quietly behind her. Her father stood motionless, eyes red, mouth set in a line of disbelief. The prosecutor gathered her files with slow precision. The defense attorney lowered his head. The girl sat back down, staring blankly ahead. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. The words "term of confinement" replayed over and over, like a loop she couldn't escape. She wanted to wake up, to find herself back in her room, staring at the ceiling, realizing this was all a nightmare. But the heavy air, the echo of the gavel and the officer stepping toward her said otherwise. As the bailiff gently motioned for her to stand, she looked toward her parents. Her mother mouthed something, maybe "I love you," maybe "I'm sorry." She couldn't tell. Her eyes then drifted to the jurors one last time. Not a single one met her gaze. And as she was led from the courtroom, her mind flashed to that video, that moment she'd laughed, unaware that those few seconds would define her life forever. She'd thought the camera was harmless. She'd thought no one would ever see it. But the truth had a way of surviving, of waiting patiently for the right moment to speak. Now it had spoken, and it had cost her everything. The sound of the courtroom door closing behind her was sharp and final, a sound that seemed to slice through the thin thread of denial she had been clinging to. The hallway beyond was quiet, lined with faded walls and humming lights that flickered faintly above her. Each step she took echoed against the tile floor, heavy with meaning. Her wrists were cuffed loosely in front of her, the cold metal biting into her skin, just enough to remind her this wasn't a dream she could wake from. The officer leading her didn't speak. His expression was unreadable, professional, detached. But even that silence felt like judgment. As they walked past a row of benches, she caught glimpses of faces, reporters scribbling notes, families waiting for other hearings, a janitor pausing mid-sweep to watch her pass. Every glance felt like a spotlight. Every whisper felt like a verdict. When they reached the transport elevator, the officer pressed the button and stepped aside. The elevator doors slid open with a dull groan, revealing a narrow, sterile space that smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant. She stepped inside, her reflection staring back at her from the polished steel. The face looking back wasn't the confident girl from the video. It wasn't even the tearful one who had begged for mercy minutes earlier. It was someone hollow, someone who had finally run out of stories to tell. The doors closed, and for a long moment the only sound was the hum of the elevator descending. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking the silence in a whisper meant for no one but herself. It wasn't supposed to be like this, but it was. And there was no undoing it now. When the elevator doors opened again, she was met by a new world, one stripped of warmth or familiarity. The processing room was grey and bare, filled with the echo of clinking keys and low voices. A female officer stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and gestured for her to follow. They took her fingerprints, her photograph, her belongings. One by one, her rings, her necklace, her phone, all placed into a small plastic bag with a white label bearing her name. Each item felt like a piece of the life she was being peeled away from. When they handed her the facility-issued clothing, a shapeless grey uniform, she stared at it for a long time before finally changing in silence. When she looked in the mirror afterward, she barely recognized herself. The clothes hung loosely. The color drained her skin. The girl who had once practiced smiles in front of her bedroom mirror for social media now looked like she'd been erased, replaced by someone smaller, quieter. Hours passed in a blur, signatures, questions, instructions. She answered them mechanically, her voice faint, detached. Eventually, an officer led her down a long hallway, lined with locked doors, each one with a narrow window, revealing small, identical rooms. "This will be your room," the officer said, unlocking one of the doors. The word room felt merciful. It was a cell, no matter how gently he said it. The inside was bare, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a metal toilet, a sink, and a single shelf. The officer handed her a folded blanket. Lights out at 10. You'll have an orientation tomorrow. She nodded mutely, stepping inside. The door closed behind her with a heavy metallic click. She stood there for a long time, staring at the blank wall in front of her. Everything felt impossibly still. No noise, no voices, just the distant echo of footsteps fading down the hall. When she finally sat on the bed, her knees gave out beneath her. The blanket slipped from her hands, pooling on the floor. She covered her face and cried quietly, the kind of crying that came from exhaustion, not guilt. The kind that comes when the world finally stops moving and you're forced to sit in the silence of your own choices. That night she barely slept. Every sound, every clank of a door, every muffled voice in the corridor jolted her awake. When her mind did start to drift, it always returned to the same image, the frozen frame from that video, her own face mid-laugh, projected on the courtroom wall. It haunted her. It followed her. In her mind, she tried to rewrite it. She imagined herself crying instead of laughing, apologizing instead of mocking. She imagined the jury seeing that version, the version she wished existed. But no matter how hard she tried to picture it, the real version always returned, bright and cruel and final. Days passed in slow repetition. Morning wake-up count, breakfast, chores, counseling. She didn't talk much to the others. Most of them were like her, young, caught in mistakes too big for their age. Some watched her with curiosity. Others avoided her completely. Word had already spread. Everyone knew who she was and what she'd done. During one of her counseling sessions, a middle-aged woman with soft eyes asked her gently, "Why did you lie?" The question hit harder than she expected. She stared at her hands, tracing the faint bruises left by the handcuffs. "Because I thought the truth would make everything worse," she whispered. "And did it?" the counselor asked. She looked up, tears welling again. "No," she said after a long pause. "Lying did." The counselor nodded slowly, saying nothing more. The silence between them said enough. Weeks turned into months. Letters from home arrived less frequently. Her mother wrote about missing her, about hope and forgiveness. Her father's letters were shorter, practical, distant, but still there. Every time she read them, guilt pressed heavier on her chest. Sometimes at night, she would sit by the small window above her bed, staring at the slice of sky she could see through the bars. The stars looked faint, distant, like memories of a world that used to belong to her. And she'd wonder if, when she finally got out, she'd ever be able to leave behind the version of herself trapped in that courtroom, the girl who laughed when she should have cried. By then she had stopped pretending she was the victim. She had stopped rehearsing stories to make herself sound better. The truth was simple now, painful but clear. She had lied. She had played innocent when she wasn't. And it wasn't the crime alone that destroyed her life. It was the lie that followed it. The seasons shifted outside those grey walls, but for her, time moved differently, measured not in months or years, but in the weight of realization. Every morning began the same. A loud buzzer, a counter, tray slid through the door. The world beyond the concrete never felt further away. The first few weeks, she kept telling herself this was temporary, that somehow an appeal or miracle would send her home. But the letters from her lawyer slowed, and even hope stopped visiting. Her reflection became her only companion. In that small mirror bolted to the wall, she watched herself change. The makeup gone, her hair pulled back, her face thinner, her eyes less defiant. There was no sign of the girl who once smiled for the camera, the one who thought she could talk her way out of anything. Prison had stripped away the performance. What was left was raw, real, and finally honest. Every now and then, she'd replay the moments leading up to that crash. The laughter in the car, the music, Dominic's voice in the passenger seat, Devon joking from the back. Then the silence, the flash of the wall, the world turning white. It came to her in dreams too, always the same ending. No breaks, no hesitation. Just a choice that could never be undone. Sometimes she'd whisper their names under her breath before lights out. A quiet ritual of remembrance. She never said them out loud during the day. It felt like she didn't have the right. One afternoon, about a year after her sentencing, a counselor brought her a stack of letters. Ones she hadn't opened. They were from the families. Some written in anger, others in sorrow. But one stood out, a handwritten note from Dominic's mother. It wasn't long, barely a few sentences, but the words hit her harder than any verdict ever could. "I will never forgive what you did, but I pray one day you'll understand what you took from us. Not just a son. You took peace from everyone who loved him, including yourself." She read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her Bible. That night she didn't cry. She just sat awake until dawn, staring at the pale blue light seeping through the tiny window, realizing that forgiveness, from anyone, even herself, wasn't something she could demand. It had to be earned, one silent day at a time. Months later she began attending group sessions, not the ones required by the facility, but ones she signed up for voluntarily. Grief recovery, restorative reflection, victim awareness. She listened more than she spoke. Sometimes she'd hear other inmates tell stories of their crimes, their regrets. For the first time, she saw her reflection in them. Young people who made impossible choices and spent every day trying to live with the aftermath. When it was finally her turn to speak, her voice trembled at first. "I used to think I could control how people saw me," she said quietly. "That if I smiled enough, said the right words, people would believe me. But lies don't erase the truth. They just delay it until it explodes." No one said anything for a while. Then one girl across the circle nodded slowly. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close to understanding. Years would pass before she'd get used to the silence that filled her cell. By her 3rd year inside, the guards noticed she'd stopped asking questions about release dates, about appeals. She'd started mentoring younger inmates instead, trying to talk them down from the same reckless edge she once lived on. "Every decision feels small until it ruins everything," she'd tell them. And they'd listen, not because she was older or wiser, but because they knew she had lived through it. Her family visited less often now, not because they didn't care, but because life outside had continued. Her parents had aged, her friends had moved on. Social media, once her stage, had long forgotten her name. And for the first time, she was grateful for that. She didn't want to be the headline anymore. She just wanted peace. Then, one winter morning, nearly 4 years after her conviction, she was called to the warden's office. She assumed it was a disciplinary meeting, but when she walked in, the warden's tone was calm. "You're being transferred," he said. "Minimum security. Behavior, education credits, counseling, they all count in your favor." It wasn't freedom, but it was movement, a step forward. That night, she lay awake again, staring at the faint outline of the moon outside her window. She thought about Dominic and Davin, about who they would have been if that night hadn't happened, about the families who still grieved them, about the courtroom and the silence that had followed the video. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the dark. Not as a defense this time, not as a plea. Just a truth, a small human truth. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she'd never escape what she'd done. But maybe, in the long stretch of years ahead, she could become someone who didn't run from it anymore, someone who lived differently. The camera that once loved her was gone now. No spotlight, no staged smiles, just a girl alone in a cell, learning to face the reflection she'd spent years hiding from. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first honest thing she'd ever done.